Just a week before our CJS bill was marked up in subcommittee, NASA submitted a $1.6 billion budget amendment that intended to start the effort to advance the return of humans to the moon by 4 years. Such little time prevented us from adequately considering the proposal. This hearing will give us an opportunity to obtain more information from NASA regarding its revised plans for returning to the moon. While all of us on this subcommittee would like to send the first woman astronaut into deep space, including to the surface of the moon, we want to do it in a responsible way, from the perspectives of safety, cost, and likelihood of mission success. As most of you know, I have been a strong supporter of NASA during my 29 years in Congress, and we provide NASA more than $22.3 billion for FY 2020 in our House bill. However, I remain extremely concerned about the additional costs to accelerate the mission to the moon by 4 years. Some experts have said that additional financial resources needed to meet the administration-imposed 2020 deadline could exceed $25 billion over the next 5 years, compared to the original 2028 schedule. To date, NASA has not provided the committee with a full cost estimate despite repeated requests. At a time of huge financial needs across numerous government programs, all competing for funding within the budget caps, an additional $25 billion cost would severely impact vital programs not only under this subcommittee, but across all non-defense subcommittees. Another concern that I have is the lack of a serious justification for such a cost. Since NASA has already programmed the lunar landing mission for 2028, why does it suddenly need to speed up the clock by 4 years, time that is needed to carry out a successful program from a science and safety perspective? To a lot of members, the motivation appears to be just a political one, giving President Trump a moon landing and a possible second term should he be reelected. Not even NASA's own leadership has enough confidence in the success and safety of advancing this timeline. NASA Acting Associate Administrator Bauer Sox, who is a former astronaut and here with us today, referred to the 2024 moon landing date as difficult to achieve in a House Science hearing just last month, saying, quote, "I wouldn't bet my oldest child's birthday present on anything like that." Additionally, NASA's manager for the Human Landing System, Lisa Watson-Morgan, was quoted in an article about the timing of the mission saying, quote, "This is a significant deviation for NASA and the government. All of this has to be done on the fast, has to be done on the quick. Typically in the past, NASA is quite methodical, which is good. We're going to have an abbreviated approach to getting to approval for industry standards for design and construction. And how we're going to go off and implement this? So this is a big shift, I would say, for the entire NASA community too," unquote. "We cannot sacrifice quality just to be quick. We cannot sacrifice safety to be fast. And we cannot sacrifice other government programs just to please the President. Before asking for such a substantial additional investment, NASA needs to be prepared to state which NASA missions will be delayed or even canceled in the effort to come up with an additional $25 billion. Overall, I remain extremely concerned by the proposed advancement by 4 years of this mission. The eyes of the world are upon us. We cannot afford to fail. Therefore, I believe that it is better to use the original NASA schedule of 2028 in order to have a successful, safe, and cost-effective mission for the benefit of the American people and the world. Thank you once again, Administrator and Acting Associate Administrator, for being with us today. I look forward to hearing your testimony. And now I'd like to recognize at this time my good friend, the Ranking Member, Mr. Idaho, for his opening comments.
Thank you for yielding, Mr. Chairman. And first of all, I want to thank you for your leadership on this subcommittee, your willingness to have hearings throughout the year, but in particular for this hearing. Regardless of party labels, the House Representatives will miss your leadership, your professionalism, and your kindness, and we look forward to working with you, of course, through the rest of this Congress, and we have a long way to go. So we know you're not leaving yet, but I would be remiss if I didn't mention that this morning. I also appreciate the ranking member, Kay Granger, being here today and for her engagement with these issues. She's put a lot of hard work and expertise in the defense issues and on the space issues over the years for her district and her state and for the country. And also, I'd like to express my gratitude to the President and to the Vice President for taking a real active interest in NASA. And compared to other agencies, it represents a very small part of the national budget, but which continues to stir the dreams, it stirs the ambitions of the entire nation, especially young people. And that is evident when I go into schools and have a chance to talk about things related to space, and everyone is still very interested in it as ever. Mr. Administrator, Mr. Balsox, thank you both for being here today, and I strongly support the President's goal to land the first woman and the next man on the moon in 2024. In support of that goal, I believe we owe it to the taxpayer and to the mission to make sure the program remains focused. However, to make it to the moon by 2024, NASA will need sustained congressional investment and taxpayer support. The Artemis program cannot afford to suffer the kinds of delays, the setbacks, and the cost overturns which have sometimes become what is known as business as usual in our space program. On the contrary, the Artemis era is supposed to be characterized by unparalleled accountability and agility. Today, I'll have questions regarding whether NASA is still committed to getting to the moon by any means necessary. As an ardent supporter of deep space exploration and also as physical conservative, I'm concerned that NASA could undercut its flexibility and incur unnecessary costs by foregoing opportunities to leverage existing assets in an attempt to simultaneously foster a commercial space economy. Director Bridenstine, this past March, Vice President Pence declared in his comments, if NASA is not currently capable of landing American astronauts on the moon in 5 years, we need to change the organization, not the mission. And I couldn't agree more. The administration's ambitious but critically important 2024 moon plan will be the ultimate test of NASA's judgment and its accountability. Finally, the rockets and the capsules and the transfer vehicles and the descent and ascent landing systems must, above all, be systems which will keep our astronauts alive during the mission and bring them back to Earth safely. As our nation embarks on complex new deep space endeavors with unprecedented private sector involvement, safety must be our #1 priority. Hence, NASA's ability to ensure safety in the Commercial Crew Program will be a bellwether, and I appreciate the Administrator's comments noting that Commercial Crew Program must receive the contractor attention it deserves. So, again, I thank you both for being here today. It's an honor for us to have you here before our subcommittee, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing today, and at this time, I'll yield back.
Thank you, and thank you for your kind comments. We are honored this morning to have our ranking member with us, a person that I respect a lot and a person that I will remember for her way of dealing with people in such a friendly and professional way, and bipartisan wherever she could, which was like 3% of the time, but only kidding. Ms. Granger.
Thank you, Chairman Serrano. Thank you, Ranking Member Adderholt. Thank you for holding this hearing and also for your attention to space and your involvement. I'm old enough I remember the space program as it was, where everyone was sitting at their television, their black and white television, and watching it, and it was good for America, and it was good for all of us. Welcome, Administrator Bridenstine, and welcome, Mr. Bowersox. Thank you for your stewardship to the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, it's important to all Americans, and it's our nation's space exploration goals. In March, your agency was challenged with returning our astronauts to the surface of the moon within the next 5 years. I strongly support this accelerated to 2024 goal and the Artemis program, appropriately named after Apollo's twin sister. Sending American astronauts, including the first woman, to the south pole of the moon will showcase the global leadership and technological advances of the United States. Will also enhance our national security by allowing us to establish a strategic presence on the moon. Our nation is facing serious threats in space, specifically from China. I've had classified briefings that would shock any reasonable person and that clearly made the case that we must accelerate the Artemis program. My advocacy for the Artemis program was solidified after learning about China's capabilities and their future plans. Unfortunately, the U.S. has largely fallen behind in space research and development and will soon be outpaced by the Chinese if we don't take action immediately. The only way to protect both our national security and our economy is to dominate space and beat the Chinese and other near-peer adversaries. Space, I believe, is the next high ground, and we have to take it. The decision to accelerate our nation's return to the moon and establish a sustainable presence there will require significant investment by this and future Congresses. As a result, support for this ambitious but important 2024 timeline will be accompanied by great expectations, both in terms of schedule, cost, and safety. Administrator Bridenstine and Mr. Bowersox, we recognize that you have a tough job ahead of you. I am committed to working with you to ensure that NASA can advance our nation's exploration priorities as effectively and as efficiently as possible. And I look forward to working with Chairwoman Lowy, Chairman Serrano, and Ranking Member Adderholt in funding for NASA's programs as the appropriate process moves forward. And I yield back.
Thank you. Before I ask the administrator for his comments, people who know me would wonder what's wrong with me if I don't do a shout out here. We spend a lot of time in the city of Washington. It's like a second home to all of us. So shout out to the Nationals for pulling the upset of the century. And people thought they couldn't do it. It should be a lesson to all of us. Just keep trying, and you can pull it off. And now I can only get the Yankees to turn it around against Houston. But anyway, that's another issue. Mr. Administrator, 5 minutes. We will include your full statement in the record, so please go ahead.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before I became the NASA administrator, the President had issued Space Policy Directive 1, and that direction was to go to the moon, to go sustainably, to go with commercial partners and international partners, to utilize the resources of the moon that we discovered back in 2009, the hundreds of millions of tons of water ice on the South Pole. The water ice represents life support. It's air to breathe. It's water to drink. It's, in fact, rocket propellant. Hydrogen is the same rocket fuel that will power the Space Launch System. It's the same rocket fuel that powered the space shuttles. So we're going to use the resources of the moon, and then ultimately we're going to take all of this knowledge that we learned in this architecture at the moon, and we're going to go to Mars. That was all in the President's first Space Policy Directive. When I became the NASA administrator, we put together a plan. Given our current budgets, what will it take to achieve this? And we came up with a plan, as you identified, that put us on the moon in 2028 if budgets remain fairly constant. The challenge that we have as a nation is that the longer programs go, the more political risk that we have. And when we look back in history, we look back to the 1990s, the Space Exploration Initiative. It took, decades in time, and it eventually got canceled. We look at the vision for space exploration in the early 2000s. Again, it took many, many years, and it eventually got canceled. And so the question is, how do we reduce risk? There's two types of risk. There's technical risk, and then there's political risk. And the political risk, it's not partisan. It's just when programs go too long, people start losing confidence, and then money gets redirected to other places. So one of the reasons to go fast, and I heard, Mr. Chairman, I heard you very clearly say slow and methodical. Methodical, yes. NASA is all about doing things step by step by step and building on one lesson after another. What we're trying to change as a culture is that word slow. We don't want to be slow. And I think going fast makes sure that we will have successes. I also think that by going fast, we put ourselves to the ranking member's position. We put ourselves in a position to lead the world. Right now we have international partners. 15 of them are with us on the International Space Station. We've had astronauts from 19 different countries on the International Space Station. We've had experiments from 103 different countries on the International Space Station. But China is moving fast, and they are going to the moon. And the last time they landed on the moon, they landed on the far side of the moon. That was in the beginning of this year. They landed with a small probe. And it was the first time in human history anyone had landed on the far side of the moon. They took out a 2-page ad in The Economist magazine and made very clear that they are the world's leader in space exploration and that everybody in the world should partner with them. Well, I think that's the wrong position. So we have political risk that we need to deal with. It's political risk from programs taking too long. It's political risk from a geopolitical standpoint, making sure that our partners are with us and not with them. I think those are important reasons to move faster. But we do not want to take any undue risk. We do not want to put any lives at stake. But I can tell you the history of NASA might be a little more slow than what is necessary. And we are changing the organization. As Representative Adderholt said, if we can't land on the moon within 5 years, we need to change the organization. And I believe that with all my heart. And I'll tell you why. Because in the 1960s, President Kennedy announced, 1962 at my alma mater, Rice University, he announced we're going to land on the moon before the decade is out. And at the time, we didn't have the Johnson Space Center. We didn't understand the orbital dynamics of going to the moon. There was so much. We didn't have the launch facilities. We didn't have a rocket that could get to the moon. We didn't have any of these capabilities that currently we now have to our advantage. They had to go from scratch. They didn't have the miniaturization of electronics. They didn't have the ability to store power in smaller quantities. They didn't have the ability to reuse rockets and do all of these other things that are on the cusp of changing how we do spaceflight. So if we can't do it today within 5 years, when they did it within 8 years and really 7 years back in the 60s, I think we do need to change how we do things. And I think it is important that we go faster. I heard the ranking member say that we need to leverage existing assets. If we go fast, if we want to land on the moon in 2024, which we want to do, and they said if we wanted to go fast, how fast could we do it? Well, 2024 is how fast we could do it. And at the end of the day, I think it's important to note that that's not a guarantee, but it's in the realm of what is possible. And a lot of things have to go right to make that a reality. And what we're asking for in the budget request is to give us an option to make going fast a possibility. So I think these are all important things that we need to talk about today. And Chairman, I appreciate you having this hearing. Ranking Member, I appreciate your comments as well. And I look forward to answering any questions.
Thank you. We'll now begin the first round of questions. With each member will receive 5 minutes. The Appropriations Committee has repeatedly asked for information regarding the additional costs of moving the moon mission up by 4 years. To date, we have received no response. It is hard to justify any extra spending on this effort in the current fiscal year when we don't know the costs down the road. What is the additional cost associated with moving up the schedule for the next moon landing by 4 years from 28 to 24? And further, can you please break the cost down by year for the upcoming 5 years? And let me just tell you, on a personal level, although we're here in public, and you know me, we've dealt in the past on a personal level. This is not just about finding the money. It's about where this president is known to go find monies when he needs them. Now, if he came to us and said no wall in return for 24, you might get a few Democrats to agree with that, right? Maybe more than that. but he's probably going to say lower Pell Grants, lower food stamps, lower education dollars, and that's unacceptable, and that's the problem. But I asked you a question, and I'm sorry I didn't give you time to answer it.
So the request for 2020 includes an additional $1.6 billion, and you know, I have been very clear with everybody I have talked to. The goal to get to the moon needs to be bipartisan. It has to be apolitical. And if when we go to the moon, we're doing so by cutting the Science Mission Directorate of NASA, that will create a partisan divide that we do not want to have as an agency. If we try to take the money from the International Space Station, that'll create a parochial fight, maybe with members from Texas or Florida, Alabama, about the International Space Station. Now, those are the two big areas where NASA has money. But I don't think that the right approach is to cannibalize those programs to achieve the moon landing. And so I've been very clear with everybody I've talked to on both sides of the aisle. The goal should be additional resources, not cannibalizing one part of NASA to feed another part of NASA. That being said, when we did the budget amendment, the $1.6 billion, we were operating under previously established budget caps. And I think it's fantastic that an agreement was made between Republicans and Democrats to raise those budget caps that gives NASA a great chance. And I also want to say, Mr. Chairman, we're grateful for the mark that you did in the House because you did great work, especially on behalf of the Science Mission Directorate, and that's really good for the agency. So I want to take nothing away from the House mark. But it's also true that when we go forward with trying to get to the moon in 2024, that requires additional resources. And I understand the concern with the out years, and we want to give you the out years. We are working right now inside the administration with the Office of Management and Budget and the National Space Council to come up with what those out year numbers are, to get a consensus within the administration about what we're willing to put forward. And once we have that, we want to give it to you as absolutely soon as possible. I would also say that the budget submit for 2021 is due in February, and certainly we will have it in the 2021 budget submit without question. If we look at what the Senate has already done, they actually fenced the money pending getting the full report on what the out years look like. They fenced the 2020 money based on what the out years look like. I think that is maybe a good solution, something to consider. But I think at the end, we want to give you those numbers. We're not ready just yet, but certainly we still want to move forward.
At the expense of beating a subject to death, you were very clear that you don't want to take money from other NASA programs because you don't want to hurt those programs. I don't want to go to the moon by taking money from people who can't afford to survive in this society to the level that they should survive in this society. And so that is a big problem that we have to get over. That's where that money is going to come from. Your fiscal year 2020 budget justification was delivered to the committee earlier this year, and it is still available online. In looking at the out years budget chart that is included in that budget, what parts of NASA's budget do you anticipate would need to go down during the 2021 through 24 period, compared to the numbers displayed on your earlier budget chart in order to pay for the additional costs associated with the schedule change on the moon landing? What is the cost to other priorities to achieve this effort?
So my objective is to let everybody know that cannibalizing certain parts of NASA to fund another part of NASA that's not my goal. Certainly, we're going to need additional resources, and I've been clear that whether you take it from station, whether you take it from the Science Mission Directorate, those are the two areas where there's money. When we do that, it creates either parochial fights or partisan fights, and I am trying to maintain NASA's apolitical bipartisan approach. So I would say that my goal is to not cut any of NASA's budget in order to finance the moon agenda. The budget submit for 2021 will be delivered in February of next year.
I'm having a little trouble getting my message through, so I'll try one more time and then I'll drop it, okay? You don't want to hurt NASA. But you please understand that NASA has support from members of Congress.
Yes.
NASA has support from this committee, as our Mark showed, as our Bill showed. NASA has support of the American people, including the very people you would hurt. But would you keep that support if the people knew that eventually you would have to take money from their very needed situations, you know, a factory worker who needs a little extra from the federal government to help feed his family, and now NASA's going to go to the moon 4 years earlier based on taking money from them. That's you know, I don't need an answer for that, just to think about that as we go forward. And my time has been used up, so Mr. Adderhold, of course.
Thank you. Regarding the comments you made about SLS production work after your visit to Michoud back, I think it was mid-August that you were there, I was wondering how you think things are currently going for work on the SLS rocket, especially 1 through 3.
Absolutely. I will tell you, you know, we've had some very challenging conversations with Boeing, and of course you have seen that in real time, maybe in the public. I would also tell you that they have responded in a very positive way to the challenges that we've had with SLS development. Number one, we have now started, or in fact we have completed the integration of the engine section. So the engine section, which was the holdup, kind of got delayed, and so we started integrating the rest of the rocket in the horizontal, which enabled us to integrate the SLS rocket while the engine section was still under development. Previously, if you do the vertical stack, everything has to wait on the engine section. Well, we changed that. We started integrating in the horizontal, and Boeing did great things in order to make that happen. The engine section is now complete. The engine section is now integrated into the rocket itself. And by the way, we are very satisfied with how fast things are moving now. And at this point, the engines themselves are being integrated into the engine section. And as soon as that is complete, there will be probably a month or two, maybe a little bit longer, of testing at Michoud. But I think by the end of this year, we will be moving the SLS rocket out of the Michoud assembly facility, moving it to the Stennis Space Center for testing for what we call a green run test. So Boeing has, in fact, responded very, very well, and we're very pleased with where the SLS is right now.
So you're confident that it will be delivered on time?
Well, the new time, yes, sir.
Yeah. Oh, and of course, as you mentioned, I've heard work that is progressing more quickly.
Yes.
On the second core, maybe 40% faster.
A lot more. Yes. So what we learned on the first SLS is paying dividends on the second SLS. So things are moving a lot faster. And I don't know, Ken, do you want to address that?
I just say that that's true. I mean, we are moving faster on the second core, but we're still finding new challenges, right? I mean, there's still new rockets, and even on the second core, I think we might find a new challenge or two. But overall, the trend is positive.
Does it seem to you that the work is indeed faster than core number 1?
Absolutely.
Yeah, no question about that.
Without question.
All right. I understand there is a growing confidence among the prime contractors for SLS to be able to produce 2 rockets a year starting in 2024. And they believe they could deliver a Block 1B in 2024. What do you think? You think it could be done?
So it depends what Boeing is willing to invest, quite frankly. We don't have currently the appropriations necessary to achieve that. If we were to do that, we might need some more infrastructure that currently doesn't exist. So, Ken, I don't know, do you want to address that?
Well, what I'd say is we haven't seen the performance yet that would indicate that we're guaranteed the second core we'd need for a moon landing in 2024. We're open to considering those types of options. We're looking for that type of progress, but we just haven't seen it yet, sir.
So to be clear, I am confident that given our current rate of production, we will have 3 SLSs available that, and the third one would be for Artemis 3 that takes us to the moon in 2024. I think that is fully within the realm of possibility, but a lot of things have to go right to make that happen. Adding an additional SLS into the mix I'm not confident that that could happen.
All right, understanding the complexities of integrating the SLS as both of you do you have any reason to believe that the broad agency announcement for the human landing system presents a viable opportunity for offerers to engage the prime contractors and forge the necessary agreements in order to incorporate an SLS into the proposals before the response deadline that's in November 1st of this year?
Again, this would be a question for Boeing specifically. They would need to look at the SLS and come up with an SLS derivative that would be made available to the offerers for the human landing system, and then figure out how they would deliver that to those offerers. But I think it would require investment from Boeing to do that, and the goal would be that those offerers would select Boeing as their provider of that launch service, but it would be a launch service. So I think it's in the realm of what is possible if Boeing wanted to make those investments.
You want to comment on that?
I just concur with the administrator.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Let me recognize now our ranking member, Ms. Granger.
Thank you. Administrator Bridenstine, could you pretty succinctly, to me there are 3 questions. One is, why should we accelerate this at the cost it is? What's the primary importance of that change, and whether it's worth that very large investment? And then focus on the sensitivity of the national security and say, what does it mean to taxpayers? Because we're talking about how you pay and what it costs. And say, talk to us about that and say, then how does that benefit our taxpayers?
Oh, it's huge. And this, I think, goes to what the chairman was talking about earlier about the trade-offs. We will look back at Apollo, and we just celebrated 50 years of Apollo. Everybody in America loved it. We saw 500,000 people on the National Mall celebrating 50 years of Apollo. And I know all of us, we have seen 500,000 people on the National Mall before. We've never seen 500,000 happy people celebrating something good. That was a very, very great day for NASA. It's a great day for America, and it's 50 years later. The inspiration that came from that moment in time was transformational for our nation and transformational for people that, went into the STEM fields that otherwise never would have done that. And you walk around NASA and you ask folks, hey, why are you here? They will tell you where they were when Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin walked on the moon. And I'm sure the people that are of age on this committee could probably tell me where they were on that day as well. I will tell you, the sad thing is, and this is why we need to go faster, I'm the first NASA administrator from that day to this day that was not alive when that happened. I think that's a big challenge. I mean, the reality is I don't have that memory. And we've got to make sure that we don't have another generation that goes by that doesn't have that memory. And when it happens, we need to make sure that it is the United States of America leading a coalition of nations that makes it happen. But going to your question about what is the value to the taxpayer, all of that I think is tremendously valuable to the taxpayer. It was a piece of ultimately winning the Cold War. I'm not going to say it was the preponderance of it, but it was a piece of it. Now, all that being said, remember, some people watching this, I know this is on TV. Some people watching are going to watch on Dish Network or DirecTV. Maybe they have internet broadband from space. I come from Oklahoma, rural Oklahoma. If you don't have broadband from space, you don't have broadband. So communication, navigation, GPS technology, born from this little agency called NASA. The way we do disaster relief, national security and defense, all of these capabilities, I should say a lot of these capabilities born from a little agency called NASA. The way we predict weather weather satellites are purchased by NASA. And of course, the program management of those weather satellites is NASA. How we understand climate and how it's changing is done by NASA. The way we produce food, we're increasing crop yields, decreasing water usage, preserving nitrates in the soil. All of these technologies come from NASA. The way we produce energy and do it cleanly without greenhouse gas emissions, methane leaks, those kind of things. We can detect it from space instantaneously, help the oil companies prevent getting fined from the EPA. These are things that are transforming how the world moves forward, and these technologies and capabilities have elevated the human condition for all of humanity in ways that if you ask Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin, why are you going to the moon, they wouldn't have said any of that because they wouldn't have known. But now we know. The return on investment for these we're less than 0.5% of the federal budget. And you look at what we've been able to deliver by creating technologies and capabilities that get commercialized, that elevate the human condition. I think the return on investment is just outstanding.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. You're not scoring any points by reminding people that you're younger than some of us. Mr. Cartwright.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you, Messrs. Bridenstine and Bowersox, for being here. I don't think it's any secret that as a member of the NASA and planetary caucuses, I share your enthusiasm for NASA, and I believe in your mission, and I support your people, and I'm willing to bet that everybody on this subcommittee feels the same way.
Thank you, sir.
But we are appropriators, and we have to deal with the dollars and cents.
Yes.
And we have to evaluate budget requests, and I appreciate your comments about not cannibalizing one part of NASA for another. But the fiscal year 2020 NASA budget requested an overall reduction of $480 million, including a reduction in the science budget of $600 million and the complete zeroing out of the Office of STEM Engagement. You submitted that, didn't you, Administrator?
So yes, that was in the budget submit.
So we have to drill down on this stuff. This subcommittee rejected those cuts for fiscal year 2020, just as we did in FY 2018 and 2019. We increased NASA's funding by $815 million, which fully funded the lunar landing program and robustly funded scientific discovery and STEM education. If you're detecting a pattern there, you're right. Look, the 2020 NASA budget request evidently did not adequately fund Artemis, because a mere 2 months later you submitted this $1.6 billion supplemental request for increased Artemis funding. And what I'm trying to do is I'm grappling with the true cost of the program and whether NASA has a firm grasp on it, how much money you need for Artemis, and when you're going to need it. So the first question is, at what point did you realize that the fiscal year 2020 budget request was insufficient to fund the Artemis program?
Well, I would say for that budget request, there wasn't an Artemis program at the time. We put together a budget to land on the moon at the earliest possible date without any changes to the budget or with, changes to the budget based on inflation. And at the end, we were able to say, and it was a stretch, but we could say we could land on the moon in 2028. I
don't mean to interrupt you, but the question is asking, when did you realize that the 2020 budget was going to be insufficient for the Artemis program?
So after the 2028 date came out, there were a lot of people that said that's too long. The challenge is when these programs last a decade, there's risk from a budgetary perspective.
Okay, I think I'm with you. So It was after the acceleration of the program that
That's
you
right.
realized you didn't have enough money. That makes sense. And so you didn't know, before submitting the fiscal 2020 budget request, you didn't know about that acceleration. Fair?
We had not planned to accelerate at that point.
All right. Now, you've described the $1.6 billion supplemental request as a down payment. And here's what we're kind of grappling with, Administrator. what's the total cost of the whole program? I mean, you go to buy a car, and there's a car salesman standing there, and what do you ask him? You ask him, how much is the car?
Right.
And when he comes up to you and he says, well, it's only going to be $2,000 in the first year. And you say, yeah, but I'm asking you how much the car is. And he says, what do you mean? Well, I mean, after the first year, how much do I have to pay for this car? And he says, oh, no, those are the out years. That's not acceptable. You need to know the total cost. And, you've said, I think in response to the chairman's question, you don't have those figures.
Well, we are working through with the Office of Management and Budget and the National Space Council to come up with an administration consensus for what the total cost will be, and we will submit that in February.
February of this coming year. You're going to have those figures for us?
It'll be part of the budget submit in February, yes, sir.
Okay. And do you know, sitting there today, how much extra the whole project is going to cost because of accelerating it?
So there's a lot of different options that would be available. Some of the options increase the probability of success. Some of the options decrease the probability of success. And based on the range of options, and these are what we're looking at as an agency and working with the Office of Management and Budget, attempting to come to resolution on. For example, I really believe it would be in the interest of success to start off with at least 3 different human landing systems that we could then down select to 2 human landing systems. So we have dissimilar redundancy, and that gives us a higher probability of success. If the budget constraints put us in a position where we can only have 1 human landing system, we put ourselves in a position where a contractor could have pricing power that could get us in a position where we have cost overruns and schedule delays. So I don't know that that's in the best interest of the agency. It's not in the best interest of success. But here's what we know. We know that more money early reduces cost, but if we go inexpensive early, then the likelihood is that cost goes up over time. So these are all different trades that we are looking at this point for the out years that we are anxiously anticipating delivering in February.
All right. Finally, Science Committee Chairwoman Eddie Bernice Johnson raised an issue regarding the specific appropriations language with the included with the $1.6 billion supplemental request, and I want to follow up with you on that point. Is it your understanding that the language in the supplemental request would allow NASA to transfer funds from other agency accounts to pay for Artemis?
That is not the intent. The intent is to have as much flexibility as possible within Artemis. There are some things that go fast and some things that where we find what we don't know. There's unknown unknowns that we have to be prepared for. And so that flexibility gives us that. I have heard people concerned that we're going to take money from the Science Mission Directorate to fund human exploration operations. That is not my intent. Nobody I've talked to at NASA indicates that that's anybody's intent.
And specifically, I'm going to quote her, she said, the language would give you carte blanche authority to move funds among NASA's accounts from this year forward if you determine that transfers are necessary in support of the establishment of the U.S. strategic presence on the moon, unquote. And you're saying that's not so.
Look, this has to be bipartisan, and I think if we put ourselves in a position where one side of the aisle is not happy with what we're trying to achieve, we will not be successful. We want to make sure this is apolitical and bipartisan as much as possible. And I think, again, cannibalizing the Science Mission Directorate to achieve the objectives of human exploration, which, by the way, I don't think they're exclusive of each other. That narrative gets promoted a lot, but I don't think they're exclusive. I think they work hand in hand. I think it's within the realm of we don't have any desire to do that. We want to make sure that we have the support of both sides of the aisle.
So no cannibalism in the February figures.
Right.
Thank you.
Agreed. We agree on that.
Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Administrator Bridenstine and Associate Administrator Bowersox, for being here today. I really appreciate it. Under NASA, the American space program has been a symbol of world leadership and national pride. At this crucial point in our history, we must use our investments wisely and work even harder to advance sound policy if we expect to maintain American leadership in the space domain. To help NASA centers across the country engage with the commercial industry and become better stewards of their underutilized infrastructure, we have introduced H.R. 4304, the NASA Enhanced Use Lease Authorization Act of 2019. This bill will reauthorize NASA's EUL agreement authority for 10 years and is supported by representatives from both sides of both parties and across the country, from Virginia to California and everywhere in between. Administrator, can you elaborate on the ways NASA centers across the country have successfully used EUL agreements to reduce operating costs and improve NASA facility conditions?
Absolutely. So, I think there's some really good examples of infrastructure that would include buildings, for example, where a private company wants to use a building that NASA is not using currently, and part of the way they have access to that building is to make it usable and improve it. And then, after a period of time, NASA has the rights to that building again in the future, or they could continue their lease. So these are all good things where NASA can partner with the private sector. We have similar kind of agreements for launch facilities, and of course, as you're familiar with at Stennis, test facilities. So I think there's lots of opportunity to improve NASA's facilities by partnering with the private sector. And Ken, did you have anything to add to that?
Well, I think you've hit a couple of them. You've hit a couple of those, the launch pads at the Cape. There's lots of the production facilities and operations facilities at the Cape where we're using those type of agreements. At just about every center where we've got spare capacity, we're trying to find users from outside NASA who can come in and take advantage of those facilities. So it's been really helpful to us.
Not reauthorize an EUL, what would happen?
It'd be really bad for NASA. It'd be really bad for our private sector partners. Please reauthorize it.
Well, great. And that please also to my colleagues on this committee, if you haven't signed on to H.R. 4304, I know Ms. Capter and I would appreciate it if you would take a hard look at it, and we'll get it to you. So another question is, I'm proud to represent Stennis Space Center, where NASA has tested every rocket since the Apollo program. And as I'm sure you know, the SLS core stage is scheduled to ship from Michoud to Stennis this December for the Green Run engine test. We are encouraged by the progress on SLS this year as we near the completion of the first flight rocket for Artemis 1 and continue to see the rocket for Artemis 2 being built. Given your rationale for SLS undergoing the Green Run test and the plan to conduct a similar Green Run test on the exploration upper stage at Stennis, do you believe the lunar lander provider should also conduct a similar Green Run engine test as part of the development program? And if not, what is the rationale for not putting the landers through the same thorough and rigorous testing as the SLS core stage in EUS at Stennis?
So I'll start, and then I'm sure Ken will have some thoughts on this as well, because he's an astronaut that has had the experience of riding on these kind of vehicles. I think it's important that we recognize that what the commercial providers ultimately provide, a lot of it could have already been tested. We're not saying how to land on the moon. We're asking them to propose to us how they would do it. And if to go from the gateway, which is that space station in orbit around the moon, to get to the surface of the moon and back to the gateway, if to do that, we're using hardware that has been tested significantly, a transfer vehicle, a descent module, an ascent module. When you talk about propulsion, there could be solutions that have a lot of history that we wouldn't necessarily need to Green Run test. However, there could be brand new designs with brand new capabilities that it might be necessary. I don't want to prejudge what NASA is going to require, but certainly, depending on the solutions that we get presented, we will have, of course, thoughts on it. Ken?
Yeah, all I'll say is, we're going to very carefully look at all the test plans that we get back from the human launch or human landing system providers once the proposals are all in. To talk a whole lot more in detail wouldn't be good right now since we're in blackout for the proposals. But depending on the type of engines they have, Stennis might be a great place for testing, but other types of engines we've done at different places at NASA, and companies have done it at other places around the country, but they'll be thoroughly tested before they get to the moon.
Thank you for your responses. I yield back.
Mr. Case.
Thank you. The overall purpose of the hearing is to discuss with you whether the big picture, long-term fiscal and operational considerations have been thought through, were thought through when we got a pretty sudden and unexpected request for a supplemental appropriation. So it's one thing to deal with the supplemental appropriations, another thing to deal with kind of the implications of it over the long term. And you have commented in response to the chair's question that you would be submitting with the FY21 budget a long-term out-year projection for this particular proposal, correct?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
And does that submission include an updated full life cycle mission cost, assuming a 24 mission?
Yes.
Okay. Does it include, you're proposing to outsource essentially a lot of this work, right? So you're going to have a whole bunch of development partners out in the private sector on fixed contract situations. That's your intent, right?
Yes.
Okay. Do you that's going to take a lot of internal supervision because that's a lot of money running wild out there, and if not adequately overseen, it could easily get away from you budgetary-wise as well as I would suspect quality-wise. So do you anticipate that in your recalculation of an accelerated mission you would beef up your oversight capabilities inside NASA?
Well, I think we have pretty good oversight capabilities already. What we're doing is we're applying the lessons of the past. If you look at how we resupply the International Space Station right now, we do it with what we call commercial resupply. What that means is NASA doesn't purchase, own, and operate the hardware. We buy a service from a robust commercial marketplace. That robust commercial marketplace was, in fact, developed by NASA with our investments, where we invest our money, our commercial providers invest their money. We started off with 3 different providers. We down-selected to 2, but now they're competing against each other on cost and innovation, which does drive down costs. It makes sure that we're continuing to innovate to drive down costs, and the goal is to create a competitive environment. And because we did commercial resupply that way, the cost savings have been significant. And we're on the cusp of having success with commercial crew as well. The interesting thing is when we do programs in this fashion, the contractors don't come back to NASA and ask for more money all the time. In fact, they both want to be first. And so we do absolutely provide, our engineers are embedded with their engineers. Our finance folks are working with their finance folks. Our development and the fixed price that you mentioned before, that fixed price has milestone payments associated with it, so we are controlling the process all along the way. But the goal here is to have, as much as possible, we want NASA to be a customer of services, especially for low Earth orbit, and then ultimately not just a customer, but also have providers, numerous providers that compete against each other. Now, that's how we're doing the low Earth orbit activities, but we need to go to the moon. To get to the moon on schedule, we're gonna need to use the SLS rocket, and that's going to be a great program going forward for long periods of time.
Okay,
so different. It's a mix.
I got it. So I would just suggest to you that's a concern of mine at least that that you be able to watch big accelerated contracts. And then number 2, do you anticipate that a corollary of your proposal to accelerate would also be an acceleration of a Mars mission? Is that sequential? In other words, is that a big picture, long-term consideration that this committee should know about? Because if it may not only be about the moon that you're asking an accelerated program for, and I don't think we would want to be surprised on that one. We'd want to know what the big picture, long-term plan is for the overall deep space exploration
Yes, sir. Congressman Case, you are hitting the nail on the head, which is the sooner we get to the moon with an architecture that is sustainable. We need to learn how to live and work on another world. That's what enables us to go to Mars. When we go to Mars, we have to be there for a long period of time. So we have to use the moon as the proving ground so we can get to Mars. If we delay the moon program, by definition, we're delaying the Mars program. If we accelerate the moon program, we are by definition accelerating the Mars program. That's a great question and a good point.
Thank you. I hope we get that information in the context of FY21 as well.
Yeah, yes, sir. We'll make sure we will have strong Mars content in the budget request.
Thank you.
Sveng?
Thank you, Administrator Bridenstine and Associate Administrator Bowersox for being here today. Administrator Bridenstine, earlier this year when you were here, you testified about what NASA is doing to increase opportunities for women in STEM careers at the agency. I wanted to circle back to something specific you said in your comments about spacesuits and the then canceled all-female spacewalk. You said, quote, "It should be noted that the spacesuits are in essence little spaceships. Each one of them is designed specifically not just for the astronaut but also for the mission. The challenge is we only have a certain number of spacesuits," quote, end quote. You also stated publicly at a Senate Commerce hearing that NASA is looking at a spacesuit architecture that is flexible to allow astronauts to conduct missions in low Earth orbit and the moon. With yesterday's announcement of NASA's 2 new spacesuit designs for Artemis, I wanted to ask a few questions. One, do we know how many years did NASA need to research and develop spacesuits that Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin used?
Oh, that's a good question. I honestly don't know, but I'll be happy to make sure I get that back to you. So the question is, how long did it take to develop the original moonwalking spacesuits? We'll look that up.
Thank you. What lessons did NASA learn from the canceled all-female spacewalk at the International Space Station that might help with the research and development of the next generation spacesuit?
I think we had already learned the lessons. I think that was made it very transparent that spacesuits are very difficult because they're so large, and we need spacesuits. So the history of NASA is to build a spacesuit that works and then try to downscale it. And when we do that, it's a lot harder than starting small and then upscaling it for larger people. So we need a spacesuit that can go from the 1% to the 99% in size, and I think we have already been investing, as you saw yesterday with the announcement, in making that possible, not just for space flight but also for walking on the surface of the moon. We're very committed to it. We have been committed to it for a long time. The spacewalk that you referenced obviously highlighted why we have been committed to it. I know Ken probably has something to say on the spacesuits.
Well, I was just going to say that on the way here this morning, I got to check the TVs in our ops center there at NASA headquarters, and I saw the 2 women on orbit right now preparing their spacesuits to go outside, and that was really exciting for me to see. And we hope to see that EVA really soon. Part of the problem we had last time was, we're resizing the suits for the spacewalkers who are going to go out on this EVA, but the suits at that time needed even more work than what we're doing for this particular EVA. So that was part of our issue.
So we are doing the all-woman spacewalk here in a matter of days. We're very excited about it.
What challenges and maybe key milestones must be met with a 2024 timeline to bring astronauts to the moon? Research, testing, deployment.
Right. So the SLS rocket, the biggest, most powerful rocket ever built that will take our astronauts to the moon, is at Michoud. It's going to come out of the facility here by the end of the year and go to Stennis to get green run tested. The Orion crew capsule and the European service module are complete. They will be testing soon up at the Glenn Research Center in Ohio. So all of that's positive. The challenges that we have right now, we have to start with a human landing system that we don't have. You can't land on the moon if you don't have a landing system. So that's one of the reasons that we did the amended budget request. And then we are underway with the development of Gateway, which is a small space station that will be in orbit around the moon for 15 years. Think of it as a reusable command module, just like Apollo, except it doesn't get thrown away at the end of the mission. It's going to be used over and over again by multiple missions over the course of 15 years and probably longer. The spacesuits, of course, are a big piece of the architecture as well. So the SLS rocket, the Orion crew capsule, the European service module, the Gateway, and the human landing system, and the spacesuits. Now, at the same time, we're doing commercial crew, which will be launching in the first part of next year to low Earth orbit. So just know this, Congresswoman, we have, as an agency, we have more under development now than at any point in NASA's history, and these are big programs. So we are working really hard right now to make all this a reality, and we're confident with where we are, especially when it comes to commercial crew. We're confident. SLS and Orion, we're confident. Gateway and the human landing system have some outstanding issues just because they're so early in the development process. Ken, did you want to add to that?
The only thing I would just emphasize is that our biggest technical challenge is getting the landers ready for 2024. That's the most challenging part of what we've got to develop, and we're excited to take on that challenge.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you.
Ms. Kaptur.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome.
Thank you.
Administrator, really glad to have you here this morning, and I know how hard you work at your job.
Thank you.
And also, Mr. Bowersox, thank you so very much for your service to our country. I wondered if we could just step back a second from the budget request directly, and I wanted to ask you about the timetable, the change in timetable, and how the date, the accelerated date of 2024 was chosen. And then if you could provide for the record, if you haven't already done it, the original timeline, the budget proposal for that, and then the accelerated timeline and the budget proposal for that. I think it would be very helpful to us. It's quite it's a significant change. And one of my questions for the American people is, though we support you in your efforts to land on the moon and Mars, I go back to a report that Norm Augustine did many, many years ago, where he said unmanned flight could provide us with a great deal of research data and space results, whether it's commodities or whatever, than human space flight. When you add humans into the mix, it becomes much more expensive. I'm wondering whether you have read that report and whether you believe that to be outdated. And my primary question is, how is the date of 2024 chosen as a starter here?
Great question. So there's two things with the 2024 date. A number of things changed. Number one, when we came out with the date of 2028, that was based on budgets not changing significantly within inflation. There were people in Congress, the members of the administration that said 2028 is that's 10 years, and programs that last 10 years, obviously they get cut. Historically, that's been the history of NASA, going back to the Space Exploration Initiative of the 1990s, the vision for space exploration in the early 2000s, and here we are, and this is going to be Lucy in the football again. How do we retire as much risk as possible to ensure success? And the answer was, well, we need to go faster. If we're going to go faster, then the next question was, where do we get the money? Do we cut science? Do we cut station? My response was, neither. We need to get new money, because those will create political or parochial divides between members of Congress that we don't want to create. So we got an additional appropriation, or a request for appropriation of $1.6 billion. And that accelerated the timeline. But it's not just the risk of these long programs. there's also some other changes that have happened. China landed on the far side of the moon for the first time in human history. They're going to be landing on the moon, according to them, they're going to be landing humans on the moon in 2030. When they landed on the far side of the moon, they took out a 2-page spread in The Economist magazine saying that they were the world's leader in space exploration and all the countries of the nation need to partner with them. They're building a space station, all of these things. So the question is, do we want to lead the world in space, or do we want to yield that to somebody else? And the decision, I think, the appropriate decision is to maintain the leadership and keep our partnerships.
As you look forward, what are the, and I would ask you for the chart, 2028 versus 2024, and the appropriated dollars that are necessary in both scenarios.
Yes.
Could you pinpoint a few of the most difficult technologies or systems that require concerted effort to achieve the objective? And in achieving those, has NASA a deep experience in working, for example, on the energy technologies with the Department of Energy, let's say, in some of their labs? Could you discuss a little bit about ways in which other parts of the federal government might help you achieve your objective if it isn't directly in your budget, let's say?
Absolutely, and this goes to your first question about robotic science versus human exploration. In fact, we do partner with the Department of Energy on a lot of our robotic missions because they use nuclear power, what we call radioisotope thermal generation, which ultimately powers our spacecraft when they go to Pluto. At Pluto, solar energy is just not that robust at Pluto. So when we go into deep space, we have to have different ways of getting propulsion. Radioisotope thermal generation is a form of nuclear, and it's the only way we can do deep space exploration. So we work with the Department of Energy on those types of activities. When we send humans to Mars, it would be in the best interest of our nation to use not radioisotope thermal generation, but in fact nuclear thermal propulsion, which would be an absolute game changer for how we do deep space exploration. I would also argue, and this would be, something for maybe the Armed Services Committee, but that the Department of Defense should have a significant interest in that capability for propulsion as well. So I would imagine there would be some crossover there from a capabilities perspective. So I think when it comes to communications technology, I think there's a lot of opportunity there. When we talked about super heavy lift and the SLS rocket, I think that could have a lot of applications for national security capability as well. So I think there's a lot of crossover. These are things that we think about. It's one of the reasons the National Space Council was established, so we can think cross-agency about how we do these kind of programs. Ken, did you want to add anything?
Just about everything we do in human spaceflight crosses over to what's being done in, say, in the DoD. That's, I was assigned to NASA as a military astronaut, and that's part of the reason that we do that is there's a lot of crossover. But the intent at NASA is peaceful use of outer space, right? And to be able to use these technologies to build relationships with partners around the world. But if you look at future exploration activities, the areas where we could probably cooperate the most are in the areas of nuclear propulsion and nuclear power for the surface. Those would be game changers for exploration.
Would you classify those as, for the record then, Mr. Chairman, could I just ask a listing of the most difficult technologies and systems that you face in achieving success in this project?
Sure.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Administrator Bridenstine and Mr. Bowersox, for being here today. We appreciate your presence and your service to our country. As a Floridian, space exploration both interests and excites me. It's part of our state's culture and our economy. I have companies and constituents in my district who are working diligently to develop and build SLS, Orion, EGS, but perhaps most importantly, human spaceflight can inspire our nation, as we all know, and you talked about it earlier, Administrator, and help motivate future scientists and explorers. As you both, I know, are aware, supporting the goal of sending the first woman and next man to the surface of the moon is a priority for all of us. as long as it's done safely and efficiently. Failure is not an option when pursuing an endeavor of this magnitude, because if we do fail, it could threaten our ability to ever return to the moon again. So we have to get it right. I'm sure we all agree. I want to help NASA meet its goal of 2024, but I need to see a schedule and cost estimate to understand how best for us to do that. So, Mr. Administrator, with that, you previously indicated that a full schedule for Artemis is being deferred until a new Associate Administrator for Human Exploration is in place. But it seems to me that NASA should be starting to put that schedule together now so it can be provided to new leadership as soon as they take over in order to hit the ground running. So can you discuss what work, if any, NASA has been doing thus far to put together a schedule with analysis with respect to Artemis, particularly Artemis 3?
Yes, sir. I think regarding having a new Associate Administrator for Human Exploration and Operations, what I wanted to make sure we didn't do is set a schedule for launching the SLS rocket specifically and set a schedule for launching Commercial Crew specifically until a new Associate Administrator for Human Exploration and Operations has had an opportunity to assess, because, again, accountability matters. And if I set the schedule and then they come in later, it might not be a good dynamic for accountability. That being said, this morning we announced that we will have a new Associate Administrator for Human Exploration Operations, Doug Lavero, who I have known for many years. He testified before the committees when I was in the House of Representatives that I served on. I was on the Armed Services Committee, Strategic Forces Subcommittee, Science Committee, Subcommittee on Space. He's somebody who's worked in the space environment for a very long time, very successfully with program management. That being said, our goal is to get you all of those things that you need in February. In February, we're going to do the budget submit for 2021, and we will have a run out for all of the out years in that 2021 budget submit. It is also true that if you look at what the Senate has already passed in their committee, they actually fenced the 2020 numbers pending that submission in February of 2021. So, I mean, I think that could be a solution for how to go about making sure that we are all in agreement on how to move forward, and at the same time not moving forward without being in agreement on how to move forward.
Yes, sir. So you think that would be available by February of next year? Yes,
February. This coming February.
This coming, yes. And that would include the cost estimate for Artemis 3?
Yes.
Okay. In addition to the schedule and budget, what other decisions or actions related to Artemis are on hold or otherwise may be impacted by the leadership uncertainty until it was announced this morning?
Oh, good. I think the big thing is, we have great program managers for every element of what is required to go to the moon and eventually onto Mars. And, of course, Ken Bowersox has been the acting associate administrator, and he's done just an amazing job. Of course, having an astronaut that's an engineer who's worked in the private sector. By the way, a Navy astronaut for a Navy guy. We like that. So he's been doing. I see Palazzo laughing at me. We had this conversation when I was in the House. But Ken has done a wonderful job. I'm looking forward to getting Doug Lavero on board and having him and Ken work together to achieve all of the great things we have established.
Great. Thank you, Administrator. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Administrator, part of the issue that I keep coming back to is the importance of knowing the full cost. We're appropriators. I won't be here after next year. But, we always say about what we leave our children. I also am concerned what I leave other appropriators after I leave. And if we find or got programs to find over $1 billion, number one, we're buying into the 2024 date. We don't know how much it's going to cost down the line. So I implore you, as you try to gather support from both sides of the aisle, to understand that unless we know what this is going to cost at the end, it would be irresponsible for us to take the first step. And certainly for me, and this is not about me or about him or about the other one, I certainly don't want to leave these folks after I leave this year, and Ms. Lowy leaves at the same time. We're having to figure out how to pay the other $25 billion over a period of time. And so we need to hear that from you, and we don't hear it. We don't see it. Now you spoke about February having those numbers. February may seem early in the year, but February, these guys behind me, these folks behind me are already working on numbers for what the budgets will look like. And so we need to know earlier, much earlier. Okay? Mr. Administrator, as you know, the Aerospace Safety Advisory Panel evaluates NASA safety performance and advises the agency on ways to improve that performance. Since the March 2019 announcement of the 2024 landing goal, has the Aerospace Safety Advisory Panel weighed in on any astronaut safety risk associated specifically with the new sped-up timeline? And I have to tell you that is a serious concern that I've heard from some people. By speeding it up, do we risk safety issues? Do we run into safety issues?
I think that there is a concern that I hear, that I've heard, and the concern is schedule pressure. And sometimes I think that schedule pressure is something we're concerned about. It's a historically kind of challenging thing that NASA has to deal with. And the last thing we want to do is put any undue schedule pressure on anybody. That being said, I think it's important for us to have schedules, and I think it's important for us to be able to create milestones and then work to achieve those milestones. So I think when you talk about accelerating programs, a lot of people talk about schedule pressure. I want to make sure that people don't feel pressure from a schedule perspective, but at the same time that we're working every day to achieve milestones. It's a very delicate balance, and we work on that every day at NASA. And we have great folks that have been working these issues for many years. That being said, I think probably that the ASAP has been focused on commercial crew because that's the closest alligator to the canoe right now. And I think we're getting to a good position on commercial crew, which is in the first part of next year, we're going to launch American astronauts on American rockets from American soil for the first time since the retirement of the space shuttles. And I think that's going to be a great development.
Mr. Administrator, I, like Ms. Granger, saw the moon landing on a small black and white TV set, and it was very exciting. I just want to ask you a question off the wall here,
okay.
Out of left field, because I seem to remember as part of the conversation of what the things we had learned or were able to create, if you will, as part of that whole mission. And one that I remember was something about the spacesuits having some abilities to move forward on people with disabilities or something. I don't know. Do you know what I'm talking about at all?
So I'm not familiar with that, but it's certainly something we could look into. Are you familiar with it? No. But I will tell you, our goal, and one of the reasons we're doing low Earth orbit specifically commercially, is because we want to see everybody be able to see themselves as flying into space. And when we go to space commercially with maybe it's industry, I mean, what we're using the International Space Station for right now, 2 lines of effort that have transformational capabilities. One is industrialized biomedicine. The ability to compound pharmaceuticals in space in a microgravity environment is unlike what you can do on Earth. So there's treatments that we can create in space. Right now we're proving on the International Space Station that we can create human tissue using adult stem cells. What that means is we could get to a day where we can print human organs in 3D in a way you can't do it in the gravity well of Earth because it just goes flat. These are transformational, industrialized biomedicine kind of things that I think will result in a day where we have massive amounts of capital. I think we're 3 to 7 years away from massive amounts of capital flowing into commercial space industry for human habitation in low Earth orbit. But the goal is we want to see a day when everybody can see themselves as being an astronaut. And I think having more people have more access to space is really good for the American economy. It helps our balance of payments. It becomes an export for the United States of America, reduces the trade deficit. But it's not just industrialized biomedicine, it's also advanced materials, it's fiber optics, technology we call Z-band, which will improve basically the way we do communications terrestrially, and other material sciences that can only be done in a microgravity environment of space. So I really think the goal is to have everybody know that space, we want space to be for everybody. And we're making those investments to make that a reality.
Thank you. Mr. Idaho.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to ask a little bit about commercial space launch vehicles. What commercial launch vehicles exist today or that are in development that can or will be able to launch the HLS and get to the moon to accomplish the goal of U.S. boots on the moon by 2024?
Okay, so if we're taking humans, the only rocket that is going to be available to take humans by 2024 is the SLS rocket with the Orion crew capsule. There's no other way to accelerate that program other than SLS and Orion. That's to carry humans to the vicinity of the moon, namely the gateway. When we talk about what we need at the gateway, we need a landing system. And that landing system could be carried to the gateway. The only rocket that I can think of right now that exists would be the Falcon 9 Heavy. But there's a lot of other rockets under development. You mentioned development. It would be the Vulcan, which is a ULA product. One would be the Starship, which is a SpaceX product. One would be the New Glenn, which is a Blue Origin product. I can't think of any others offhand.
There's a chance that the Northrop Grumman Omega might be able to help as well, but I'm sure there are rockets we haven't even heard about yet.
Well, how many of those are currently flying?
The Falcon 9 Heavy is the only one. Now, remember, and I think this goes to your question earlier, there could be, you mentioned, there could be an SLS-derived commercial solution. We're not shutting the door on that opportunity. Of course, that would require some investment from Boeing to achieve, but certainly in the BAA, that's open. It's an option.
How many of these rockets are going to have a full engine test equivalent to the Green Run test of SLS by 2020?
I would say SLS and the Falcon 9 Heavy.
Yeah, I mean, it's probably something that any responsible provider would do, but that's going to be up to them since they're commercial activities. But it's a typical type of test that you do preparing a rocket to go into space.
But if we're putting American astronauts on those vehicles, without question, it's not just up to them; it's up to us as well.
And what is the contingency plan if, for some reason, the commercial rockets are not available by 2024?
Well, I think right now that we have. There's a Falcon 9 Heavy that's currently available, and I think there's a number of others that are getting close.
But if the commercial's not available, then what's the contingency plan?
Go ahead.
Well, I mean, we've got the potential for multiple commercial options, so we think that we would have all those options. If we didn't have any of those 4 vehicles flying, then we'd look at what was available.
I think, Mr. Ranking Member, that would put us in a position to make landing in 2024 very, very difficult. If we don't have the additional rockets, then we're not going to be able to achieve the goal. But we're confident we will have those rockets.
It is a pretty simple fact that the smaller the capability to take cargo to moon orbit, the more launches you'll need to carry out a moon mission, correct?
Yep.
So also want to focus in on the Doug Cook, who I'm sure you're familiar with, former Associate Minister for Exploration. He did an op-ed on September the 13th in the Hill. And in that op-ed, he said that NASA's 2024 approach will require 8 new developments, 8 launches, and approximately 17 mission-critical operations to achieve its goal, quote unquote. Are you familiar with that op-ed that he wrote last month, and what would you agree with that assessment?
So I do think I have not read the op-ed. I would love to read it before commenting on it, if that would be all right. But I'd be happy to take that for the record and give you my feedback.
Okay. How many commercial launch vehicles will it take? Well, let me go back one second. I know you hadn't read the article, but would you agree with what his assessment of that?
Can you say it one more time?
The approach that will require 8 new developments, 8 launches, and approximately 17 mission-critical operations to achieve its goal.
I think that's a fair assessment.
Okay. And how many commercial vehicles will it take to launch the human landing system, including having the gateway in the critical path?
So that is open. We are not telling the commercial providers how they need to do their landing system. Some providers would indicate maybe they could do it with just 1 vehicle. Others indicate maybe you might need 3. The BAA, the broad agency announcement for the landing system is out. And because of that, I don't know how much we can comment on those activities because of the blackout.
Oh, so you said basically that's open right now.
We're not specifying how any of the commercial providers for the human landing system ought to how their systems ought to be developed. We're waiting to have them tell us what their approach is, and then we'll assess their approaches.
Okay. NASA's 2004 Exploration System Architect Study notes that after a launch plan requires more than 6 to 8 launch vehicles, the likelihood of mission loss goes up dramatically. Does that concern you?
Yeah, I think. I guess the point is the more launches, the more one of them could have a problem. Sure. And so that certainly is an issue. I would also say we would need to look at the overall architecture and see what creates more risk and less risk, how we're building the architecture and for what reasons. Having a gateway in orbit around the moon is important for a lot of reasons. It's open architecture, so our international partners can have their own landing systems, developed to be worked with the gateway. But again, so the way we're building the architecture is strategic in nature. It enables us to get to the moon. It enables our commercial partners to have opportunities to get to the moon themselves, our international partners to have opportunities to get to the moon. And so I think in general, we have to look at what we're trying to achieve and then the cost and risk associated with that. And I think we have the right architecture at this point. But I would also say when we use different types of rockets, we have dissimilar redundancy, so that actually reduces risk because if one fails, another can continue to move forward. The challenge we had in the 1980s after the Challenger accident is DOD and NASA, everybody was entirely reliant on shuttle. And when it went away, we were done. The DOD had no access to space. Not a good position to be in the 1980s. We don't want to repeat that.
This study I referred to, this 2004 study, it seems that it established benefits of using SLS-sized rockets for a lunar landing mission from a mission reliability standpoint. If that's the case, shouldn't NASA be working on completing SLS number 4 since it may be needed to help with the moon mission?
Certainly, we are. In fact, we did a letter contract. I think we signed it this morning for additional SLSs and exploration upper stage. So these are underway right now, and certainly we have a strong interest in seeing the 4th one be successful.
And you said that was agreed this morning?
Yeah, does the letter go out?
I think the announcement went out this morning, but
Okay.
the signature was a little bit earlier, I believe.
Okay.
Thank you. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. China's ahead of us in space, and I think we know this. People that are supportive of this request have said to me, if we don't move now, China will own space. And who owns space owns the Earth and our technology in it. Knowing that situation, how would the to return to the moon be affected if the funding isn't provided in the 2020?
So I think of it as a range of probabilities. There's no definitive. Can we get there early if we don't have the money, or if we do have the money? So it's a range of probabilities. I think if we look at what the Senate mark was, it wasn't the entire budget request for the Artemis program, but and because of that, it reduces the probability of success to land within 5 years. I think, but it can't be ruled out either, that it's achievable. It's just the level of risk goes up. And I'm not talking about risk to life. I'm talking about risk to schedule. So I think when we move forward, we need to think about what puts us in the best probability of success. I think we put together a budget request that puts us in the best probability of success. And I think that's what we're asking for.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Bridenstine, we've been talking a lot about the importance of commercial partners, which obviously will play a key role in getting NASA back to the moon and beyond, right?
That's right.
And I was reading the 2020 budget request from NASA and also the $1.6 billion supplemental request, and they both speak a lot about how NASA plans to leverage innovative commercial partnerships with launch vehicle providers and lander developers and companies like that. I want you to go into some more detail on that. Would you please describe how these fixed-price partnerships are helping NASA to reduce costs and accelerate development in the Artemis program?
So NASA is doing a lot of things, I think, rightly, that are accelerating processes. The tradition is, and you're aware of this, that if we have a program we want to develop, we spend 6 months maybe a year developing a request for information. Then industry spends 6 months to a year developing the information that we requested. Then we spend 6 months to a year reviewing that information and putting out a request for a proposal. Then they spend 6 months to a year replying to those proposals, and over the course of 3 to 4 years, we finally get under contract. And by the way, that doesn't include when all of the contractors protest the decision that NASA made, which costs the taxpayers lots of money, wastes a lot of time, and creates all kinds of problems for the country, which is not good. All that being said, what we're trying to do is we're trying to move faster, and the way to do that is where possible, where it makes sense, do, as you mentioned, partnerships with industry, where we put forth American taxpayer dollars, they put forth their own private investment, and collaboratively we figure out what the solution is. Now, we're willing to do that because we expect that they will one day go get customers that are not NASA. Those other customers could be international partners. By the way, we want to be in agreement with them on who those partners are. But not just international partners. It could be commercial people that want to go to the moon for different reasons. Maybe it's a technology that can only be developed in the microgravity or the low gravity of the moon. And it could be tourism, for goodness sake. There are people out there willing to go to the moon for vacation. I don't think it would be much of a vacation, but some people do. So as long as there are people willing to invest money in the capability to have customers that are not NASA, it drives down our costs, and it increases access for everybody. NASA doesn't necessarily want to always be the purchaser, owner, and operator of all of the hardware. That being said, there are times when it is in our interest to be the purchaser, owner, and operator of the hardware. And then, by the way, some of the companies that develop that capability can even offer that hardware as a commercial-like opportunity for the future. So there's different ways of doing different things, but the goal that I think is important is that we open the aperture of what is legally possible, and then stay within the confines of the kind of the legal requirements that we've been given. Don't go outside of that, but ultimately take advantage of what has been provided in the law to do public-private partnerships.
Thank you for that answer. But knowing the vital part that private contractors are going to be playing, are you satisfied that NASA has enough personnel to do the work of overseeing, the oversight work, to make sure that the private contractors are doing what they're supposed to be doing?
I think at this point we're in good shape. As programs move forward in a more robust way, we might need to reconsider the number of personnel that we have involved in these programs. I think right now we're okay. If our budgets do go up and we have more under development, we could need more support.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. NASA has a solicitation underway for industry to provide a human lander system that will be used to land astronauts on the moon in 2024. It is my understanding that the SLS, with its exploration upper stage, could launch the entire lander system on a single mission. NASA does not appear to be offering its own SLS vehicle as an available option to launch the HLS. Rather, the solicitation instructs bidders to come up with their own SLS-derived commercial cargo vehicle solution. So my question is, has there been any discussion with NASA to offer the SLS as a government-furnished equipment to launch the lander system?
So I haven't had any discussions regarding that with industry or folks that might have an interest in that. But I do think this goes back to Representative Cartwright's question regarding kind of new approaches. Certainly, we thought it would be appropriate for SLS, if there is a commercially viable option for an SLS, that's an opportunity that any human landing system provider or offerer could tap into, but that would be an agreement between them and the Boeing for that activity, or I don't know, whoever. There's a lot of prime contractors involved in that program, but I got to be really careful because we do have that BAA on the street. We don't want to say what the right answer is. We want to leave it to the HLS providers to make that determination.
All right, and with that BAA, you might not be able to answer the next question. Will splitting the lander system into 3 missions and assembling the system on orbit negatively affect mission risk and schedule?
Again, we're going to have to look at what the commercial providers, demonstrate they're capable of doing. We will look at all of that and make determinations in the source selection process. Ken, do you again, we are in a blackout, so.
Yeah, I don't want to talk about details, but, the idea of doing everything with one big rocket versus doing it with smaller rockets, each approach has its advantages and disadvantages. One of the advantages of breaking things into small pieces is we tend to do better with smaller programs as we work through the management and production of those different items. And so breaking them into chunks that we can handle could be very helpful.
Well, one thing you mentioned, I think this is interesting, you mentioned government-furnished equipment. Certainly, any offerer for a human landing system has an option to request government-furnished equipment. So if an offerer wanted to say to NASA, hey, provide this as government-furnished equipment, in the BAA, that's perfectly appropriate for them to do that. Now, what that means is we have to look at it and say, do we have an extra SLS that's available, and are we willing, and this is the other challenge, are we willing to pony up the cost for that additional SLS should it be available? Right now, we're not appropriated for that activity. That's a lot of money. So I would say doing the GFE approach on that, again, I'm not saying it's yes or no. Offerers are going to have to offer, but it does look awfully challenging to accommodate that. just from an appropriations perspective, but also from a schedule perspective.
Okay. Well, thank you, and I really appreciate your written and oral testimony here today. So I yield back.
What is the status of the parachute test and the commercial crew program?
Great question. My goodness. So we have two different commercial crew providers. SpaceX right now is rapidly iterating testing of the Mark III parachute, which is the most recent design and materials. The goal here is we're trying to meet a specific factor of safety of 1.6, which there's a whole host of numbers that go into that calculation. But we are confident that the Mark III parachute is the right system to achieve that margin of safety. What we're looking for now in that Mark III parachute is consistent and repeatable performance at that 1.6 level. So we're going to be looking at the margins for every element of that parachute. SpaceX has said that by the end of the year, they think they could get as many as 10 drop tests done on the Mark III, which would be possible. If that's possible, that would be very positive. And then we're going to look and see how that matches with the Mark II. And if it matches with the Mark II, then we might not need to do as many drop tests. If those parachute deployments don't match the Mark II, then we would probably need to do additional drop tests. But these are all things that we're going to be analyzing in the coming days. With SpaceX, they have a static fire test coming up. They have a high-altitude launch abort test coming up, and then, of course, a lot of parachute testing. Remember, this is a development program. That means we're going to learn things that we might learn things that we weren't anticipating, and when that happens, we need to be prepared for it. And then on the Boeing side, with the Atlas V rocket and the Starliner, a lot of the similar challenges with parachutes that come from the asymmetry issue from a parachute deployment are affecting them as well. But again, NASA is making sure that what we learn in each of these programs gets widely shared because we're putting humans on these rockets. And we cannot afford to have proprietary information put some of our astronauts in jeopardy.
And lastly, of course, NASA unfortunately has a reputation for overseeing projects that are sometimes over budget and behind schedule. My question to you, what has changed and how are you hoping to overcome the difficulties of that that you've seen in the past?
Yeah, so the big thing is I think the number one thing that we have to do as an agency is go forward with realism. A lot of times a contractor will tell us what they can achieve, and then we accept it and they advertise it to the public, and this is true for every contractor. I'm not singling out anyone. And then those schedules get publicized, and then we're held to account for achieving them. But I think in a lot of cases, it's not based on realism. We need to, when it comes to cost and schedule, we need to be more realistic in our assessments and know that these programs, this is a big difference, and a lot of people don't know. There is a big difference between development and operations. When we had the space shuttle, that was an operations capability. We knew that we had the shuttle. Yes, there were delays, but we had the shuttle. What we're doing now with Commercial Crew and SLS, these are development programs. So we don't know yet what we don't know, and as we go through the development and testing, we learn things, and then we have to make adjustments. So it's a lot harder to pin down what a schedule is when you're not in operations and you're still in development. That being said, I do think we can get better at being more realistic at schedule. I can see Ken has some thoughts.
I think a big part of it is the initial estimates that we give people, right? We tend to try and be a little ambitious, maybe a little bit optimistic in our initial cost estimates and schedule estimates, and maybe we need to start off being a little more, I won't say pessimistic, but realistic, so that we set out schedules and cost goals that we can meet.
Unless, let me just, what type of issues continues to slow you down, and what additional authority do you need to stay on budget and stay on schedule?
So there's a very delicate balance among the contractors involved in this process. And quite frankly, we need all of them, and we need them all to be successful. A lot of times what happens is There's contractor-on-contractor violence that ultimately undercuts what we're trying to achieve on a rapid schedule. Here's what we know. China is not going to slow down. That means we as a country need to come together, figure out what the architecture is, be committed to a process, and then move forward as rapidly as possible. Sometimes contractors are constantly undercutting each other, and that's not good for the agency. It's not good for our country. When we make a plan to move forward, we need to move forward. So I think that's one thing. As far as authorities, I'll take that for the record. I guarantee you I'll come up with some, but I might need a little time.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the additional time.
Thank you. That brings us to the end of the hearing, gentlemen. And notwithstanding whatever questions may have been asked or comments made, we support the work you do.
Thank you.
We appreciate the work you do. We can differ on one issue and try to work it out, but again, as I look at my last year in Congress, I'm proud of the fact that I was able to deal with issues that ordinarily people would think I was stereotypically not capable of dealing with, like supporting NASA and supporting other things, and at the same time looking out for the guy and the woman who are, paying rent for the apartment and having trouble paying their mortgage. And so all those folks that are already writing on Twitter, newspaper clippings already went out while we're sitting here saying that I just killed the mission. I don't have that kind of power. I didn't kill the mission. I just asked some questions that I know need to be answered before we move forward or not. So I thank you for your work. If you want a list of people I want to send to space, I'll let you know that I'm capable of doing that. Send all the Houston Astros, but anyway. I sincerely thank you for coming here today and for participating. And I thank you, Mr. Adderholt, for your input in making sure that we held this hearing. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Chairman.